thank you for this new day. We thank you for your great love and mercy towards us. We ask you for your Holy Spirit to be with us, to lead us and guide us in the study of your word, that we may be fit to present your message in the time to come. We thank you and give thanks in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, welcome again this morning to our continuing study of biblical chronology. And today is going to be a difficult study. Now, what I have done, I've put up on the board these websites. Formulab's website has a calendar converter, and I'm gonna hand these papers around. I could have printed one for everyone, but really I want you to look at the websites. And there's another one, and he just uses Formulab's calendar converter, and he has this 360-day prophetic calendar converter, which is not correct in the sense that he's trying to use the idea that there's 360-day calendar that sort of guides biblical chronology, and I don't believe that's true, but it's a really useful calendar because it has lots of different types of calendars on it and some explanations, and it's a really nice comparison of different calendars. Then there's Torah.com, and Torah.com, I'm going to hand these around so you can look at them, but Torah.com has one called Determining the Hebrew Month, and it's a really good resource for learning about the Hebrew calendar. They still have some wrong ideas, and you can look from Jerusalem, you can see the new moon for every month all the way back to the year 3,994, 96 or something. They don't go all the way back to 4,000 BC. And it's really useful. It's not always correct. So there are assumptions that everybody makes when they do their calendars. It's correct as far as what we know based upon the mathematical calculations of where the new moon would be in the sky. As you go further back in the past, it's less accurate. It could be off by a minute or two, but it's still very, very accurate. And then the last I put up there is Grace Amadon. Grace Amadon was an Adventist scholar who wrote in regular standard scholarly journals, but she has some ministry articles which you need to read, and she deals with, she's the one who, those lunar Sabbatarians always refer to her, but they never actually read her. So they try to say that she supports a lunar Sabbath. She does not in the slightest. She actually totally contradicts everything they teach. Nonetheless, her work is very, very good, and she understands the true biblical calendar. So if you read her articles dealing with Passover in the time of Christ, she's the one who really has established accurately how the Millerites would have understood the calendar. So I recommend you read Grace Amadon's articles. You can also find them if you have access to scholarly articles. There are scholarly articles that you can read, but you can't normally see them unless you have university access to them. But you can read the ones in Ministry Magazine. So those are some of the resources that a person can use to try to understand the calendars. Now what we're going to do today is we're going to look at the chronology of Genesis, of the Genesis flood. And we in our Bible study group back in Alberta, we had worked through this over a long period of time, trying all different sorts of calendars. A 360-day calendar with 30-day months. We tried the Egyptian calendar. We tried the biblical calendar that was given at the Exodus. And then we settled upon a observed lunar calendar. What would be some of the problems of trying to calculate a calendar during the Genesis flood? If you were going to use an observed calendar of the moon during the flood, what would be one of the problems you would face? The clouds, right? Now, even if you think about beforehand, we don't really know the conditions of the earth, and we don't know how much the earth changed. You know, I've looked at theories that deal with the idea that at the flood, that the year changed. So the year is a different length now than it was before the flood, and that the month changed because the day changed. Now, some of you may not understand the physics of this, but the idea is if the earth collapsed and if the earth shrunk in size by, if it had this canopy that was over it, it's like a figure skater. When they pull their arms in, they go faster, they spin faster. So if the earth had collapsed so that the outer part is now smaller, the orbit of the earth would have increased in speed. And if the earth is orbiting faster, or rotating faster, pardon me, the orbit around the sun doesn't have to change. It could still be orbiting the same, but the year would be longer because the day would be shorter. Does that make sense? Right. So we also have the moon, the cycle of the moon. So the moon itself didn't need to change at the flood. All that happened is if the earth orbited faster, it would change the length of the month. And so the month would end up being shorter. Does that make sense? So if you take the average length of a month is 29.53, roughly, 53 days. That's the cycle of the moon. That's when we see the full moon, right? Now, that's not really the orbit of the moon. That's just when we see the full moon. And that's just the average. It changes. It can be closer to 29 days and it can be closer to 30 days. So it's not always the same, and that's because the moon orbits in such a way that sometimes it's closer to the earth and sometimes it's farther away from the earth. And so it's apogee and perigee. So an apogee, it's closer to the earth, and in a perigee, it's farther away. And when it's farther away, it's also traveling slower. Its speed, its orbital speed is slower than when it's closer to the earth. And I don't know, not everybody knows and understands physics of orbits, but it's an elliptical orbit. And so that means at certain times of the month, when you have a new moon, so I know this is kind of like going to school, you know, science in grade 7 or something, but when you have a new moon, what the new moon is it's just that the moon is on the same side as the sun from our perspective on Earth. So when you have what they call a conjunction, the moon, and this is what we had during the solar eclipse. Yeah, that solar eclipse was really useful because we did learn a little bit more about the moon and the sun, right? When, you know, because we had that solar eclipse, we've probably seen some news stories that kind of explained it. But during the conjunction, the moon gets in the way of the sun, right? And so that's at a new moon. You can't have a solar eclipse during a full moon because on a full moon, the moon is on this side, the sun's on that side of the earth, right? So there's a time when we see the moon waning, and we see the moon waning. If we see the moon during the day, early in the morning, if you see the moon, that moon is waning, right? And if you see the moon early in the evening and you see a little bit of a crescent, you know that moon is waxing. That is, it's going towards the full. So when we have a sighting of a new moon, that's always in the evening. And so what would happen is the Jews, they would know that the moon has disappeared. And a month has how many days on a Jewish calendar? 30 or 29, right? So on the evening of the 29th, they would go out and look in Jerusalem, and if they saw the moon, then they would know the next day is going to be the first of the next month. But if they didn't see a moon, they would know that there's going to be 30 days. So the next day would be the 30th of the month. Do they need to go out on the 30th to observe the moon? No, they don't, because there can only be 29 or 30 days. So sometimes when you read about this, you'll have this idea that, you know, they're watching for that new moon every evening or something. But no, they just have to go out on the evening of the 29th. And if it's cloudy, then they haven't seen the moon. The next day will be the 30th. So if you have cloud, you could end up with a string of 30-day months if you had clouds all the time. But you can never have a 28th day month. So they never go out there on the 28th and say, I can see the new moon, so the next day's the first. They never do that. So this is a problem in trying to, when people are adamant about, and we're going to see this when we look at the Passover at the time of Christ, trying to establish the date that it's a Friday crucifixion in 31 AD, which is April 27th. When we try to establish that, many critics of Adventism are not considering at all the anomalies that can occur by the fact that you could have a cloudy day when the new moon is even there. So even though you look on a computer program and it says you could see the new moon from Jerusalem, it doesn't mean that the next day is going to be the first of the month. And this is a real big problem. Yes, Jeff?
You're saying they've determined the first of the month based upon their decision.
Yes. Observation, and especially in the time of Christ.
So the clouds can make the difference.
Yes.
They're going to stand on that position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it is a difficulty to try to go back in the past and know what the weather was like in Jerusalem. We just don't know. And so people become very, very adamant. There's a chronologist from Brazil who's really, really adamant that Jesus was crucified on the Friday in 31 AD, but he wants it to be the 15th of the Jewish month, not the 14th. And of course, he undoes a whole bunch of spirit of prophecy statements. And he makes claims that he's supporting the spirit of prophecy, but he contradicts her statements. So, you know, we have to be really careful that we don't use our ideas of science and our understanding of these calendars to supersede what inspiration says. So when you get this new moon, and it kind of looks like this, depending on where you are on the earth, it can be at different angles, but this new moon is the first visible crescent, and it will happen after the conjunction. So there'll be a time when you don't see the moon, and in one evening you go and you look out, and if you see this new moon, you know that the next day is going to be the first of the month. Now we're going to see that there are some differences, because in the time of the Exodus, and we're going to study that, God gave them a calendar that started in the spring, and it's a numbered calendar. So instead of just naming the months, which they do always before that, for the first time they're numbering the months, and they're numbering them from the spring. No matter what calendar you're using, whether it's a religious or a civil calendar, you're still always calling Nisan or Abib the first month. And that is for the religious calendar, because from the first day of the first month to the 10th day of the 7th month is always 187 days on the biblical Exodus calendar. And that's the one that the Jews used from then on. Now, I mentioned before that Usher didn't believe that was the biblical calendar. He had a 365-day or 356-day calendar that all the months were 30 days. That's what he believed the Jews were given. And we're going to look at the Genesis flood and try to understand why that calendar doesn't work based upon what we read here in the Scriptures. Now, there's lots of statements also in the spirit of prophecy that we could look at, and we wouldn't have enough time to look at everything that we had to look at. And so I expect that you're going to go and study this in more detail, because I could be wrong about how I look at this situation of the Genesis calendar. But I found something that to me is quite intriguing, and as I've said before, there are things that we have to do. We have to make some guesses, make some assumptions, but we shouldn't reject something that doesn't contradict inspiration and helps make things more clear, what we already know. But we also should never be adamant about our assumptions. We should never say, well, this assumption must be correct. We always have to be open to correction. So let's look at Genesis chapter 6, verse 17, and we're going to read as much as we can of this. So Alyssa's going to start, and then we'll go along here. If you can read the first from 17 to 22 of chapter 6.
And behold, I, even I, do bring a flood of waters upon the earth, to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life, from under heaven, and everything that is in the earth shall die. But with thee will I establish my covenant, and thou shalt come into the ark, thou and thy sons and thy wife and thy sons' wives with thee. And every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort shalt thou bring into the ark, to keep them alive with thee. They shall be male and female, of fowls after their kind, and of cattle after their kind, of every creeping thing of the earth after his kind. 2 of every sort shall come into thee, to keep them alive. And take thou unto thee of all flood, that is, of all food that is eaten, and thou shalt gather it to thee. And it shall be for food for thee, and for them. Thus did Noah according to all that God commanded him, so did he.
Thank you. And of course, we're really familiar with the story of the flood. And as we go through, there's details. Now, one of the things that would be nice, and we're not going to do, is to look at the reform line of Noah. And I mean, maybe we can touch on it if anybody has any ideas how it affects it. One of the things is we have come with more waymarks than we had in the past when we first looked at the reform line of Noah. And so now, you know, I look at these old reform lines and I try to say, how do these things fit? And we're going to look actually at some of the reform lines, the reform line of Joseph, and then we're going to look at Ezekiel with the 390 and the 40, and we're going to see that these waymarks that we have, midnight and sunset, bring light upon our old reform lines. And we tried to do some of this last year. We wanted to look at some of these old reform lines with midnight, because we had midnight all of a sudden. And I don't know if we ever really did that completely, but I'm sure some of you have thought about these things. So we're not really going to look at the reform line of Noah, but we're going to try to look at the chronology of this. And it will, I believe, help us in understanding the reform line ultimately. Okay, do you want to read the next 4 verses? Olivine, you want to do that?
And the Lord said unto Noah, Come thou and all thy house into the ark, for thee have I seen righteous before me in this generation. Of every clean beast thou shalt take to thee by 7s, the male and his female, and of beasts that are not clean by 2, the male and his female. Of fowls also of the air by 7s, the male and the female, to keep seed alive upon the face of all the earth. For yet 7 days, and I will cause it to rain upon the earth, 40 days and 40 nights, and every living substance that I have made will I destroy from off the face of the earth.
Okay. So one of the things we see here, we see some numbers. So we see 7, and we see 2, and obviously the 7 clean beasts and the 2 unclean beasts that are being brought into the ark. We also see for yet 7 days. So what would this phrase mean to you? So if it says for yet 7 days. So in 7 days, I will cause it to rain upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So this is then before. So there's different ways that people look at this. Some people say, in 7 days, I'm going to cause it to rain. Some people take that word yet as meaning there's 7 days in which the animals come into the ark, and then there's another 7 days in which they're in the ark before the rains come. So I haven't decided which way to look at it, but we know that there's a mention here of 7 days. Yes, Tanya?
Strong's,
Or Shamila?
the Strong's Concordance is saying yet, still, more, again, longer.
Right. So that Hebrew word yet, which yeah, it's a word that can mean again. So that means there's been 7 days, and I'm going to have another 7 days. So that's why I say it can mean that, but it can still say still. There's still going to be 7 days. So it's not really very clear in the Hebrew how to interpret that. So I have at times said there were 7 days in which the animals came into the ark, and then 7 days once the door shut that they were in the ark before it rained. So there would be 2 periods of 7 days, and that's a possibility. Yes, Bob?
So it's clear here that Noah knew when he was in the ark, shut up for 7 days, that he was going to be in there for 7 days before the rain came. He wasn't sitting there wondering why the rain didn't come while he was in the ark.
Yes.
Because he was told. It was prophetic.
Yes. That is very clear, that we know that he knows there's going to be 7 days before it rains.
While he's on the ark.
While he's on the ark, yes. And these are little details that sometimes we just pass over, right? Yes, Tanya.
In verse 2, where it says, take to thee by 7, in Hebrew is actually 7, 7. There's a doubling mark there.
Yes. And of course that, yeah, so there's a doubling of the 7. And that's because there's 7 males and 7 females, right? So there's not, 4 males and 3 females. Right. Now let's read verse 5, 5 to 8. Mario. You do that.
And Noah did according unto all that the Lord commanded him. And Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters was upon the earth. And Noah went in, and his sons, and his wife, and his sons' wives with him, into the ark, because of the waters of the flood, of clean beasts, and of beasts that are not clean, and of fowls, and of everything that creepeth upon the earth.
Okay. So, thank you. And how old was Noah? According to here, he's 600 years old. Now, one of the issues that came as we studied this, when it says that and we're going to find this, that the flood begins in the 17th day of the 2nd month. When did the Jews first start counting the months? Giving them a number in the Exodus. Because before that, they just had names of months. They never counted the months. So there was no such thing as the 1st month, the 2nd month, the 3rd month. Because they didn't have a fixed calendar. They just had a lunar calendar which observed the sky, and they named the months. And there was no reason to number the months. So when it says that it's the 2nd month, our assumption is that's the 2nd month on the Jewish calendar. What if that 2nd month is referring to the 2nd month of the year that Noah is 600? And one of the reasons that we looked at that is that Noah is also mentioned as being 601 on the 1st day of the 1st month. So we're going to look at that as we go through this. Now, it's kind of intriguing, and you'll see what I mean as we go through this, because as I looked at the calendars, we had to decide what calendar. And so we're gonna talk about that a bit more, but I just want to mention this here at this point. So we're going to go through this and see how this works. We're going to skip verse 9. Can we read verse 10 to 13? Bob.
And it came to pass, after 7 days, that the waters of the flood were upon the earth. And in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. And the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights.
Okay, thank you. Now, we have, is that how many verses I wanted you to read? Yes, right? Okay, read the next 2 verses.
In the selfsame day entered Noah, and Shem, and Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons with them into the ark. They and every beast after his kind, and all the cattle after their kind, and every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth after his kind, and every fowl after his kind, every bird of every sort.
Okay, thank you. Now, you should be looking in your notes on chapter 2, and it should be page 12. There is a calendar that I have placed, which is going to make it a little easier to visualize this. And in this calendar, we'll see that on the bottom of each month, in the corner, I have placed a number, and that number is the number according to Genesis chapter 7 and 8, that they number the months. So they say in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month. Now I had this color-coded, but once you print it in grayscale, the colors don't quite stand out the same. But on the 17th day is the days that the rains begin. And I do have a very, very tiny number beside that number 17. It's a little tiny number there. And that's the number 1. So that's the first day of the flood. So you can see that if you have good vision. And I'm numbering then the days of the flood from the 17th. So we're numbering the 17th as the first day. Now Ellen White says that when they entered into when the rains began, which day did it begin on? According to Ellen White. Does anybody know what day, what she calls the day?
I don't know, but that's not number 1. You have number 3 by it.
The 17th?
Yes.
On the 2nd month. So
Look at the 5th. You look at the 5th.
Oh,
the 17th
okay.
is the 5th.
All right. I stand corrected. I'm
Yeah.
looking at the other 17.
okay. So does anybody know what Ellen White says the days the rain began, what she calls that day? It's the 8th day. Yeah, she calls it the 8th day. So the days the rain begins, she calls the 8th day. So why does she call it the 8th day?
After 7 days.
Because 7 days have passed. So of course we know that's important, that she calls it the 8th day. So the 8th day, of course, is the first day of the rains. And so this is important because when it comes to counting days, how are we counting these days? What's the first day? It's 1. It's not 0, right? So when the door of the ark closes is on the 10th day, and that then is the first day. Okay, so we're going to look at this calendar in more detail. Some people will notice some things about it as you look at it, but let's go on and read some more. I'm going to skip a few verses here, and we're going to start at verse 17. And if we can read verse 17, let's go 17 to 24. Yeah.
And the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased, and bare up the ark, and it was lift above the earth. And the waters prevailed, and were increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. and all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl and of cattle, and of beast, and of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, and every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of life, of all that was in the dry land died. And every living substance was destroyed, which was upon the face of the ground, both man and cattle, and the creeping things, and the fowl of the heavens, and they were destroyed from the earth. And Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. And the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days.
Okay, thank you very much. So we notice some other things here that we may not have thought about. Now the flood was 40 days upon the earth. Now of course we know some people just think the flood was 40 days long. But this is the time that it's raining. And we, if we really had time, we would take a look at some of these Hebrew words to see some of the words that are translated the same in English are actually different Hebrew words. And sometimes they're different English words and they're the same Hebrew words. So there's some impreciseness here about the translation that, if you use your tools, you can start comparing some of these words. And that's something I suggest you do, but we're not going to have time to do this. So we have the rain is for 40 days. Now, it talks about the waters prevailing. So the waters prevailing is for how long? It's 150 days. So when would we start this 150 days? So we have, and I put up here, we have the first day of the first month obviously is not mentioned, but obviously it exists. And then we have this 7 days, which I'm suggesting is the time that the animals come into the ark. And then we have the door close on the 10th day of the second month of Noah's 600th year. And then they wait 7 days in the ark. And then on the 17th day of the second month, the rain begins. And it rains for 40 days and 40 nights. Of course, the fountains of the deep are broken up. And this is where the suggestion is that, if the Earth's crust even collapsed and it became slightly smaller, it would increase the rotational speed of the Earth itself, which would shorten the day, which would make the year slightly longer and make the month slightly shorter. And actually, if you look at how much the month is short compared to how much the year is long, and you invert them, you find that it would bring a 360-day year with a 30-day month almost exactly. So that's why that's intriguing. But anyway, the question is, where would the 150 days of the water prevailing begin?
Either the beginning or the end of the 40.
Amen.
Really good. Yeah. So either at the beginning of the 40 days or at the end of the 40 days. So why would somebody argue for the beginning of the 40 days?
Because the water began at that time.
Okay.
Water's present.
Water's present. Okay. Now, the most common reason is that people look at the calendar and they say, on the 7th month, the 17th day of the month, and we're going to look at that a little bit later, but they would say that at that time they come to the mountains of Ararat. They rest upon the mountains of Ararat. And if you go from the 2nd month to the 17th day to the 17th day of the 7th month, how many days is that? Okay, if it's a 30-day month, it would be 151, because we would have to count the first day as one, and the last day would also be counted. So on a superficial level, we look at that and we say, well, that's 150 days. 30-day months, it's 150 days. But based on how we're already counting, it would be 151 days. So that becomes a problem to try to fit a 30-day month into this. Now, it could be that, somehow that is either counting differently for the 150 days or to just rounding it off or something like that. But it would be 151 days if we're doing the counting the way that the Bible is counting these things. So that's a a question that we had when we tried to look at not just that 150 days, but we tried to look at all of the timelines that are given here in the story of the flood and fit them on a 360-day calendar with 30-day months. And we found we couldn't do it. Not just dealing with that 150 days, but there's another period of 150 days that most people never consider. Now, we have in chapter 8 now, so can you read verses 1 to 3? There, Kathy. Oh, yeah.
Do we have an answer to that question?
Yes, we do.
We're getting to it?
Yeah, we're going to
Okay,
get to
all right.
We're going to get answer to the question. Yeah.
And God remembered Noah and every living thing, and all the cattle that was with him in the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged. The fountains also of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. And the waters returned from off the earth continually, and after the end of 150 days the waters were abated.
Okay. So here, and if you look in your notes, we have a number of things. On the next page, we have the calendar, how I have it laid out of all the different events. So when you have that calendar, this actually explains all the different dates on that calendar on page 13. On page 14, we have this little chart in the bottom which starts with Noah and ends with Noah. And this chart is a chiasm of events. So it's not a chronological chiasm. So people have noticed that the story of Noah is written in a chiastic structure, that it's a mirror structure. And the center of that is God remembered Noah, is 8 verse 1.
81.
Yes, there, you notice that. So, but you'll notice on either side of that is 150 days the waters prevail, and 150 days the waters abate. And in looking at this, we came to the conclusion that there's two periods of 150 days, that there isn't just one period. So in looking at that, we had to say, well, where did the waters finish? When were they taken from off the earth? And that is where we started, or we ended the second period of 150 days. And so we said, well, the first period must end when the second begins. And so we worked out this calendar, when we tried all these different calendars. So the only calendar that worked was either an observed or a calculated lunar calendar where every month was calculated or observed based upon the charts that we had. And we found that the way that it fit was to start the 150 days at the end of the 40 days. So it rains for 40 days and 40 nights, and this isn't going to be, and I do have the chart there in the book, but we have 40 days and 40 nights, and then we have 150 days that the waters prevail, and then we have another 150 days that the waters abate. And they end up abating here on the first day of the first month. Right? Now you can see at the top of that page, page 14, we have this all drawn out. So we have the first day of the first month way over on the left, which is not given in Genesis there. It doesn't tell us that there's the first day of the first month, but we know it had to have occurred if there's a second month. There had to have been a first. And you can see, if you count on this calendar from the first day of the first month to the day that the door of the ark closes is 40 days, from the first day of the first month to the day that the ark closes. And I put 7 days there on the bottom, which to me is an assumption that there's 7 days that the animals come into the ark. And then we see that there's 7 days after that in which then there's 7 days they're in the ark, and then there's the days that the rain begin, and there's 40 days. And then there's 150 days that the waters prevail. And then after they prevail, they begin to abate. So we're going to read some of this here and try to sort this out. Now, one of the things is even though it's written in a chiastic structure, and we see these things mentioned in this way, and we're not going to go through each of this, but I suggest that you look at these verses. It doesn't mean it's all completely chronological. That is, sometimes they move ahead or behind. That is, they write things as a summary or whatever of what they're going to say. And this is a common way to repeat and enlarge. So when you look at chapter 8, verse 1 to 3, this to me is, they're stating this whole period, and then now they're going to repeat and enlarge it as they go from verse 4 onward. Yes, Richard?
As far as the animals coming into the ark, the 1 SP 71.3, Sister White says, for 7 days the animals were coming into the ark.
Oh, really?
Noah was preparing them. Yeah.
Well, there you have it. I haven't found that statement. So that statement is, again, give it to us clearly, and you might want to write it in your notes.
It's in a couple places, but 1 SP 71.3, the end of the paragraph, Sister White says, for 7 days these animals were coming into the ark, and Noah was arranging them in the places prepared for them.
Amen.
1 SP 71.3.
Okay. See, now, and of course, I like this because we got 2 7s in a row, right? Which is a chiasm, right? And the fact that we have this 150-day chiasm and some other structural chiasms, I think, is, an important feature of this chronology and of God's Word. So there's reason why he does this. And I also think that the story of the flood, and we're going to see this a little bit more as we go through it, but the story of the flood becomes a pattern for later things in the Bible. So God is setting up these patterns or these structures right from the beginning, just like when he gives the 7-day week at the beginning of creation. That becomes a structure or a pattern that he then uses. And plus, the story of creation is the first reform line, starting with the period of darkness and then the time of the beginning. And it's sort of this idealized reform line, with Adam and Eve, Adam being the state, because he has dominion, and Eve being the church, being the woman. There's all these things which we don't have time to look at. But we see that God sets up these patterns at the beginning. And that some of the things that happen later on, we can refer back to the beginning to understand them. And of course, we know that in this message. God declares the end from the beginning. So when we see something like this, the 2 7 days, and we see the 7 years in the story of Leah and Rachel, and then the 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine, we have already had this pattern established. And even when we look at a creation, we have 7 days of creation, and then we have 7,000 years that follow with a sabbatical cycle, 6,000 years, and then 1,000 years. So God has set up these patterns right from the beginning. And so I like that. Thank you for finding that statement, because I didn't find it. So let's read verse 4. Yes?
What is the first 40 days?
That's just from the first day of the first month. If you count from the first day, 30 days plus 10 days is 40 days, right? Yes, Jeff?
So we've recognized or taught from the beginning that the animals getting on the ark is typifying the fire of Elijah, the triumphal entry, the midnight cry.
Mm-hmm.
So that 7 would be the 7th seal that takes you to midnight, right?
If you say so. This is not my specialty knowing, but yeah, that makes sense. And the door closes. Yes. Yeah. And this door closing is really special here that we're going to see. So let's read from verse 4 and 5.
And the ark rested in the 7th month on the 17th day of the month upon mountains of Ararat. And the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, were the tops of the mountains seen.
Right. So we have a couple of things here. So obviously people have looked at the 17th day of the seventh month as being 150 days from the 17th day of the second month. But we say it's 151 days. And so I have them all counted out. And that's why it's useful having the calendar and counting out every single day and not just thinking it in your head. But we know that the waters, they come to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Now, when do the tops of the mountains first appear, according to this? The first day of the 10th month. So it's not until like 2.5 months later that they can actually see the tops of the mountains. Now, my understanding of coming to the mountains of Ararat is that right now you have the water rushing off, you know, especially in the North American continent, it's rushing off and it's coming back on. The waters are moving vigorously, and when they come to the mountains of Ararat, they have a cove or whatever where they are now shielded from these storms. So they get some rest there. But it's still within the 150 days that the waters are prevailing upon the earth. And then it says that the waters are going to, they're returning from off the earth continue. That's referring to the waters rushing back and forth. And after the end of 150 days, the waters were abated, to me refers to not the end of the prevailing, but to the end of the next period of 150 days. So, you know, if I'm wrong about that, I'm wrong about that. But Tyler?
What's your definition of prevail and abate?
Well, abate, I wish I had my computer now. I didn't bring it this time. But prevail means that they're covering and they're not going down. Abating refers to the waters now beginning to go down. And so the waters cover the earth because 40 days and 40 nights, they get the maximum amount of water. And during the time that the waters are prevailing, they're continually coming back and forth, and they're doing, we can actually see the evidence of this in North America, of the waters, the different flows of the waters and how the sediments are laid down. It's one of the evidences of the worldwide flood. Yeah, and then we have the waters abate, and so the waters abate, that means they start to go down, and they start to go down obviously before the first day of the 10th month, right? And on the first day of the 10th month, that's when you can finally see the tops of the mountains. And then they're going to continually abate for another 120 days, and at that point, on the first day of the first month, the waters have come off the earth. They can see the earth, there's no more water on the earth, but the ground is not yet dry. And so, you know, I'm kind of jumping ahead. But we're familiar with the story. So these details, we need to place them and we need to understand them. Now, we have the first day of the 10th month. So I'm going to put this in here. So here we got, over here we have the 17th day of the 7th month. And then here we have the first day of the 10th month, which is an important date. And these dates become symbols, right? We understand that. But we know that this is when the mountains are seen. Right, so the mountains are seen here at this point. And if we go back from here, so if we go back all the way from when the rains began and we count the days here, this is 220 days, right? So one of the things, we had always dealt with this number 220. Now where did we mark it before? Anybody?
You got out of the ark.
Yeah, so we marked it before, so when did it begin? No. In our other, I can't remember where we had it begin. We had it begin somewhere, but we had it when he got out of the ark. We had it happen right was it when he got out of the ark, or was it on the first day of the first month? I can't remember. Anyway, we had it somewhere. Maybe it was when he left the ark. I'm not sure. When he left the ark, and that means it would have begun 220 days. It would have probably begun when they came to the mountains of Ararat or something like that. I can't remember where we started it. Because how many months is that? 220 days.
7 months, 10 days.
Yeah, 7 months, 10 days. So you'd have to go back and look that up. And I can't remember where we used to mark it. So here we have 220 days, but it's not where we used to have it, is the main point. But it's still there. And so...
I think maybe we used to put both the 150s on top of each other.
Yes, we used to have just the period of 150 as it was just one period of 150. Now, one of the things that happens is we know on the Jewish calendar there's 12 months in a year. In this calendar that I have here, we actually have 13 months. And that's because every second or third year, they add an extra month. Now, that means in 19 years, they have 7 years in which they add an extra month. I don't know if anybody knew that, because there's a metonic cycle. So the Jewish calendar works in a cycle. Every 19 years, it repeats. And there's 7 extra months added in a period of 19 years. And when we looked at this, we had come to the conclusion, based upon all the chronology that we looked at and all the spirit of prophecy statements we could find, that this flood begins in the year 2391 BC, and that the year of the flood would be 2390 BC on our calendar. So in doing that, by looking at the cycles of the moon, we found that that would be a leap year. There would be an extra month. And you need the extra month in order to fit the 250-day periods in. So if we had a 360-day calendar, you could not have 2 periods of 150 days fitting in there. So that was one of the reasons we adopted the lunar calendar with the leap month in it. So there's a number of other intriguing things. So we're going to try to read some more of these verses because we still have more time. And we're going to deal with another period of 40 days. So can you, yes, Tanya?
My thoughts on this metonic cycle.
Yeah.
Before the flood, we know that they didn't have to deal with weather changes or whether the sun was going to be hot enough to give them the right crop. Mm-hmm. But we know that in Moses' time, that was basically the issue, that the barley had to be ready. And that's why they had to wait another extra month until the crop was ready. But we know that before the flood, they didn't have any of that issue. They never even had a rain fall down until the flood. So then my question is that how do we justify that? Because we know that a complete thing happened. I mean, when the flood came, it completely changed the weather and everything else on the earth.
Okay, well, her question really relates to the idea, how do we know what kind of calendar they had before the flood? One is we don't really know. But one thing is they didn't have to observe the calendar. They were smart enough to figure it out, calculate it without calculators. So, you know, my argument is that Noah didn't observe the moon to know when the month began, is he understood the moon. Right. And so counting those days for him was easy. When we're dealing with the barley harvest, and we're going to deal with that later on, but the Karaites created this idea of the barley harvest. There's no evidence that they're correct. And in fact, when you deal with the barley harvest, all you have to do is have some ripe grain. And grain does not ripen in all the fields at the same time, even in the same field at the same time. And the evidence is that they didn't base their year on the barley harvest. They based it upon the equinox. So that it always works out. If you start the month after the equinox, the first day of the first month is always begun after the equinox, you will always have your barley harvest work out. So the Karaites came up with this theory, and the Millerites were trying to use the Karaite calendar. We'll find that in 1844, the Karaites did not add the extra month. So the Millerites couldn't have known that, though, because at the time that they're figuring out the calendar, the communication between Jerusalem and the United States was pretty slow, so they wouldn't have known what the barley harvest was. And so they made.
From the sister that was in Jerusalem that was communicating with them and telling them about the fact. So that actually was in Jerusalem and giving account to the Karaite and the rabbinical reckoning that it was different.
Right, after the fact, though, after they had already added the month, because it takes a couple of months to get communication from Jerusalem. So they had already set this up beforehand. Plus, they also didn't understand the calendar correctly because they thought that every month you have to observe the moon. So we're going to look at that in more detail. Yeah, Jeff?
So you're saying that the year of the flood is a leap year having 13 months?
Yes.
And the book of Genesis is beginnings. So right there in the rebellion of the flood, you have the number 13 marked right from the start.
Yeah, and there's just so much as we, and part of the things that we're dealing with here as we discuss this, you know, the Millerites made assumptions, but they came to the right answer. And we make assumptions sometimes and we come to the right answer. And so we think that our assumptions were correct. But sometimes God gives us the right answer even though all of our thinking isn't correct. But over time, God is helping us understand these things much better. And the message that we have in how we fit everything together is unifying all these different aspects of truth that we just have had as separate ideas. And you know, in using the analogy of the puzzle again, you know, God has been giving us all these pieces of the puzzle. And now He's bringing them all together for us to see the complete picture. Amen. And the hardest thing for us to do, the hardest thing for me to do, is to take some piece that I've been holding on to for a long time, that I've been trying to make fit, and to then set that aside because I find out it's wrong. You know, sometimes we just want to hold on to that piece of the puzzle and make it fit somehow. And so, you know, what Jeff is bringing up is something that we just would never have considered before. So let's look at this a little bit more in detail. And we're going to look at the story dealing with the ravens and the doves. So starting at verse 6 to 12. Sherman, if you can read that.
And it came to pass at the end of 40 days that Noah opened the window of the ark which he had made, and he sent forth a raven, which went forth to and fro until the waters were dried up from off the earth. Also he sent forth a dove from him to see if the waters were abated from off the face of the ground. But the dove found no rest for the sole of her foot, and she returned unto him into the ark, for the waters were on the face of the whole earth. Then he put forth his hand, and took her, and pulled her unto him into the ark. And he stayed yet other 7 days, and again he sent forth the dove out of the ark. And the dove came in to him in the evening, and lo, in her mouth was an olive leaf, plucked off. So Noah knew that the waters were abated from off the earth. And he stayed yet other 7 days, and sent forth the dove, which returned not again unto him any more.
Okay, thank you. So one thing we notice here right away is there's another period of 40 days. And so we have 3 periods of 40 days. Now the first period isn't mentioned, but it's implied since from the first day of the first month to the 10th day of the second month is going to be 30 plus 10, which is 40. And now we have another 40 days. And it says after 40 days. So the after 40 days is after the mountains appear, the tops of the mountains appear. Would anybody disagree with that? That would be the only place you could really place it that I can think of. Yes, Bob?
I just do have a question with just showing the math. How do you get come to the 220 days? Can you just quickly do that?
You count them on that calendar.
Okay.
You just count. I have them all numbered. In one of the corners of those calendars, I have them numbered. And that's why it was important to write out the calendar and actually count. Because, you know, sometimes when we count, we don't quite do it correctly. So, so we have the 220 days. We have the 40 days that then follow that. And after the 40 days, what happens? Right. Yes, we have triple sevens there. Yeah, so he sends forth a raven, and the idea is that the raven goes to and fro until the waters were dried from off the earth. So the raven, it comes back, it might land on the ark or whatever, but it's not coming back into the ark. And the raven is strong enough that it can, you know, it can survive. So, however that is. Now, then what does he do next? So after 7 days, so he sends forth the raven at the beginning of a 7-day period, right? And then after 7 days, he sends out a dove. And what does the dove do? It just comes back. Okay. And then he waits yet other 7 days. And again, he sends forth the dove out of the ark. And yeah, so the dove comes back with an olive branch. And then he sends forth the dove finally again, but it doesn't return. Okay? So that's 3 periods of 7 days. Is everybody understanding the count of that? Yeah.
The raven.
The raven. So he sends out the raven.
But that could also be interpreted as being sent out on the 17th day of the 7th month, because in the line 7, he sent forth the raven until the waters were dried up, and the waters weren't dried up until the 10th month.
No, actually, the waters are dried up, we'll find out later, is on the first day of the first month. So the 10th month is when the tops of the mountains appear, and then there's 120 days until the first day of the first month that the waters are dried up. So we'll find that later. But so any other clarifications?
Where do you get the 3 sets of 7?
Okay, where do we get the 3 sets of 7? So he sends out the raven, and then he waits 7 days.
It doesn't say that.
Okay, so are we saying that he sends out the raven and the dove at the same time? Yeah, it doesn't mention the 7 days 3 times. So the first 7, because this I struggled with myself. That's why I was wondering if anybody else was going to struggle with it. So, because at first I wanted there just to be 2 periods of 7 days. Yeah, see, but what I want is not always what we end up with. But it says, so the question is, when it says in verse 8, also he sent forth a dove from him to see if the waters, the question is, did he wait 7 days to do that? And I don't know if I have a really good answer. I think I looked at a Spirit of Prophecy quote, which I didn't put in my notes, and I can't remember where it is. But from what I gathered, that's why I changed my view from 2 periods of 7 days to 3 periods of 7 days. And also he sent forth a dove from him to see, and it says the dove found no rest. So if he sent them both at the same time, there would be 2 periods of 7 days. If he waited 7 days to send the dove, then there would be 3 periods of 7 days. So yes, Richard.
A little bit of an aside, but I think it's kind of cool because the word raven, when you look it up, a part of its definition is from its dusky hue.
Yes.
And then you go into the root word, and this is where it looks like Arab or whatever, or Arab.
Yeah.
but it says through the idea of covering with a texture to grow dusky at sundown, to be darkened toward evening. I don't know what all that means.
I don't know what that means either. Yes, Olivine, and then...
After the flood, this is Patriarchs and Prophets, chapter 8. It says, Noah and his family anxiously waited for the decrease of the waters, for they longed to go forth again upon the earth. 40 days after the tops of the mountains became visible, they sent out a raven, a bird of quick scent, to discover whether the earth had become dry. This bird, finding nothing but water, continued to fly and from the to and from the ark. 7 days later, a dove was sent forth.
And that's why I changed my view.
What page?
So, and Luke,
This
we were
is
just
page
gonna
105, paragraph 3.
Yeah, thanks, both of you, for looking that up. Yeah, this is kind of nice. I don't have to look things up. You guys can do this for me. Yeah, so there's going to be lots of symbolism here that, you know, at this point, we're not going to be able to address. But I believe that people are going to be studying this and looking at this in more detail. And I think it's helpful that we're starting to sort some of these things out, because you'll see lots of different opinions that we've had about the chronology of the flood. And we still will have those until God unifies our message. But this is, you know, this is the kind of thing that I enjoy doing when I study. And it's really nice with a group. And I just want to bring up a point of, you know, the importance of the group, because I think about some of the disagreements that have existed, you know, throughout history, but within this movement at times. And, you know, we know the pioneers, when they had a disagreement, they would come apart, they'd pray and study, and then they'd come together and allow God to solve those. And that's really what we have to do. And that's the process that I see happening in this morning class, as I've watched it for the last few years, is we are learning together, and God is leading us together as a people. And that to me is extremely important. And so sometimes our little views that we have that we think are important, we have to be willing to follow how God leads the group. Yes, Jeff?
You segued into something that I wanted to say. I got an email from Brother Chawatu, and he says that he does not teach that the Daniel 11 is sequential. He understands verse 23, goes back into history. Okay. And so I'm making that correction now.
Okay.
And that he also is open for correction on what he has understood about the first day of the first month and 9/11.
Amen. Thank you. Well, that's good news, which is what I expected. But yeah, and that's the thing is, you know we have some things that we're trying to sort out right now dealing with sunset. And, you know, I'm trying to sort it out. I think everyone here is trying to sort it out. And I believe that as we go back, we always have to go back in order to move forward. Right? We have to see we have to make sure we're on the right path and that we're not going off. And so thanks a lot for that, Brother Jeff. Now, so we have dealt with, we read up to where?
Verse 12.
Verse 12, okay. Now, verse 13 and 14, Tanya, I guess you're reading those.
And it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried up from off the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark, and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. And in the second month, on the 7th and 20th day of the month, was the earth dried.
Okay. So we have here 601st year of Noah's life on the first day of the first month. So my suggestion is that this calendar, the numbering of the months, is referring to the months of Noah's age. Okay? Not to the months according to the modern Jewish calendar or even the Exodus calendar. Now, in doing that, what I tried to do is find a fit, because we know that months on the Jewish calendar from the first day of the first month to the end of the 6th month are always 30-29, 30-29, 30-29, 30-29. But when you get to the 7th month, they actually observe the moon, and with the 8th month and the 9th month and 10th month, all the way through, from then on they observe the moon to start the months. But I'm assuming here that they're just observing or calculating the month, every month, and that the months, some months are going to be longer, some are going to be shorter. So the best fit that I found in 2391 BC and 2390 BC was to begin the first month of Noah's life, not on the month in the spring, and not on the 7th month, but on the 6th month. And so if you look at this calendar that we have here, I have it that it's the 6th month Elul, or however you say it. That's an abbreviation, so it's got another L at the end. And you can see there's 30 days in that month, and then the 10th day of that month, it's called the 2nd month, according to the 600th year of Noah's life, but it's the 7th month on our calendar now. And I have the year starting on the 13th of September, and I'm going to hand these out. You can just quickly pass these around. Hopefully they don't distract you too much. These are from these different websites just dealing with that month. And, you know, I suggested you go to the websites and look at them too.
What you just said about the calendar here,
Yeah.
we're following you.
Okay, so we have this calendar, and what we have is this is the first month of the 600th year of Noah's life, but it's the 6th month now on the Jewish calendar. And it's September 13th that the first month began of Noah's 600th year, but it's the 6th month on the Jewish calendar. So the 2nd month is the 7th month on the Jewish calendar. And the date, on the 10th day of the 7th month, when the door of the ark closes, would be the Day of Atonement. But notice the date. What month is it and what date is it on the bottom? So it's October 22. Now I didn't notice this when I made it. So when I made this calendar, I didn't notice it until I presented in Eatonville, and I just then noticed that the date that's given is October 22, 2391 BC, that the door of the ark closes. Now my suggestion, and this is just a suggestion, so if this is correct, that this is the 600th year of Noah's life, that they're numbering them, and if I'm correct that his 600th year begins in the 6th month of what we would now call the Jewish calendar, that the 10th day of the 7th month being the day that the door of the ark closes, the reason why God would have given the 10th day of the 7th month as the Day of Atonement was because that was when the door of the ark closed. Because there's no other reason why he says the 10th day of the 7th month. But that's just a suggestion, right? No proof of it, but it does make sense. Yes, Tanya?
At another level, the 7th month, the 22nd day of the month of Tishri, is the ending of the Feast of the Tabernacle.
Is the what?
The end of the Feast of the Tabernacle.
Yes, yeah, the 22nd is the end of the Feast of Tabernacles. Of course, this is the 10th day of the 7th month, but it's the 22nd day of October, right? So if you look at that, the bottom dates on all these are our months with the numbers for our months, and then the top numbers are the Jewish month, and then the number in the corner on the top, or wherever on the top, the big number is always the number of the month of the Jewish month nowadays. And then the bottom numbers, those big numbers, are the numbers of the months. And I see there's a typo there.
You said were months, but you meant days, right? No?
For which?
Just now.
No, I'm talking about months. Those big numbers are numbering the months.
What did you say before that, though? You were talking about the numbers in the calendar.
Oh, the little numbers. Yeah, the little numbers. So you have two numbers for each date. The top number is the
specific month, so you can say the like the Jewish month.
Okay, so when we look at the 6-month Elul, that's September 13th, but it's the first day of the 6th month on the modern Jewish calendar.
Okay.
Now, according to the Genesis, it's going to be the first month of Noah's 600th life, or 600th year of his life. Then the next month is the 7th month on the Jewish calendar, Tishri. It's October 13th that Tishri 1 began in 2391 BC. And so you can see October 13th, 14th, 15th. If you look, follow that numbers along the bottom of that, it goes to 22nd. The 7th month, 10th day, is the 22nd of October.
Okay, got it.
And then I have all these little tiny numbers that are just counting those days. So you can see when I count from the 3rd day of the 7th month, or the 2nd month, however you want to look at, when the animals begin to come into the ark, I numbered it on the bottom left side of our dates, 15th, and I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then the 10th day begins a count of 1 of 40 days. And then when that 40 days ends, then the first day of the 150 years is going to begin. So on the 41st day, that's the first day of the waters prevailing, and so forth. So that's how I did it. I know it takes a little bit to figure out the system, but if you spend some time with this yourself, you might be able to either refine it or correct it, or affirm it as being correct. Yes.
So what's the big numbers in the bottom right-hand corner of each square?
That's the dates, that's the names of the months according to Genesis 7 and 8. So when it says the 2nd month, the 10th day of the month, that's that bottom corner, right-hand corner of each of those months. But I'm saying that that 2nd month is really the 7th month now, according to the Jewish calendar. And that those numbering of those months are according to how old Noah is. So that means
So he's the calendar.
he's the calendar, because they haven't numbered the months in the time of Noah. The point of reference is how old Noah is. Right? So that's an assumption, but it works. So unless there's some reason why that's wrong, I think it's very powerful, especially that it places the 10th day of the 7th month, according to the modern calendar, which is the 2nd month in Genesis, but it makes it October 22nd. And it's the Day of Atonement. And that's the day the ark closes. So, if it's correct, it's pretty amazing. But there's no way I can prove it. I have no definitive proof that unequivocally that is correct. But it does work. Now, the thing is, it doesn't take away from the fact that these first day of the first month is a symbol in the story of Noah. So I'm not going to adjust it and say, well, it's not really the first day of the first month when they take the roof off the ark, and that it's actually, because that's at the bottom there, what is the 6th month there, it's October 3rd that they take the roof off the ark according to my chronology. So it's the first month of the 601st year of Noah's life. I'm not going to say, well, no, it wasn't really the first day of the first month, because as a symbol, it is still the first day of the first month. And the first day of the 10th month is a symbol. So the dates that are given in the Bible, the numbers that are given, still retain the symbols that they do based upon how they're told to us. Does that make sense? Okay. But yet we can also take that 2nd month, the 10th day of the 2nd month, and say, if it's the 7th month, the door closing on the 10th day would be the Day of Atonement. Now we could, even if it wasn't true, we can still say the door closing on the 10th day would be the reason why God chose the 10th day in the 7th month to have the Day of Atonement, because it is a closed door. But if it's the 7th month also in the story of Noah, then it's even more powerful.
Amen.
Yes, Larry, you have a...
So are you saying that before the flood there was always 30 days in a month, and then no? Okay.
We don't know.
We don't know.
We don't know. And I don't know if we have a way of knowing. Now, it is possible that at the flood that the days changed. Now, for Noah then to know how to count the months, if the months are changing, maybe he knows this in some way that we don't, we can't fathom, that he discerns this in some way. I don't know. I think it's possible, and I've looked at mathematically at what would have to happen to the rotation of the Earth to change from a 360-day year and a 30-day month to what we presently have. And it is possible at the flood that occurred.
So you're saying that it's pointing more to that?
I'm just saying it's possible, but I don't know. But what I'm saying is that if I take where the months are 30 and 29 based upon the moon, during the flood, this is during the flood, this isn't even after, so this is during the flood, we end up with this chronology that works. We can count out the 150 days, we have a 13th month, which we would not have if it was a 360-day year. We would not ever have a 13th month. And so we have some symbols or testimony that say this makes some of what we already know and understand to be clearer. And so unless there was a really, really good reason to reject this because it contradicted inspiration, there's not a reason to oppose it. It doesn't mean you have to accept it as true, but it shows us some things. And it could be that God is using, even if it didn't happen exactly like this, it helps us understand the calendar can be applied. So maybe both calendars could be applied in some ways. I don't know. But I don't see how you definitely can't get the 250 days fitting into a 365-day year. Yes, Jeff?
I appreciate how you're not being dogmatic about what you're saying, but if you make the assumption about this structure, and then as you look at the structure, if you find 2 or 3 points of reference that fit, isn't that establishing it?
Yeah, I would say it's an establishing it, but not if we find some inspiration that contradicts it. That is, sometimes we will come to the conclusion, we'll say, this makes so much sense, and then we find a spirit of prophecy statement that just contradicts what's made so much sense to us. And the human nature can sometimes say, well, Ellen White is incorrect here, or maybe her writings were manipulated by somebody, or she doesn't have all the light. So we've seen that. People do that, where they have this little point or something that they believe, and when we come with an Ellen White statement, they dismiss it, or a Bible statement, and they dismiss it. We can't do that. We have to be really, really careful that inspiration trumps common sense, if that makes sense. Maybe human reasoning, maybe that's a better way to put it. So it's extremely important how we approach the scriptures. And we have to take our shoes off our feet. This is holy ground. And, we just can't run with something just because it appeals to something about our thinking.
But if it's got 2 or 3 internal witnesses, then it's established.
Yeah, and I would say that what Jeff is saying, 2 or 3 internal witnesses, we have a whole bunch of things here that makes it really, really compelling to accept this chronology. And we're going to find the same thing, because tomorrow we're going to study the story of Joseph, and we're going to deal with all these chiasms and some of the controversy over this. But there are so many things that have not been considered about the whole overall structure that we're going to have to look at. And these are extremely compelling because they tie the story of Joseph chronologically to the 2520 and the 2300 days and 70 weeks, and all these things are tied together in a whole complete structure. And if we move one of those pieces of that structure, the whole structure collapses. And so, we're going to look at that tomorrow. And I think this is important as we go through and study this stuff. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to be dogmatic about some of these things, especially things that are controversial. But I believe that if they're true, if we all study them, we will find that they're true, and we're going to find other truths, things that, that I'm not aware of, that are going to fit and to demonstrate to us as a movement that God is leading this movement, and it's not a stray man here and another person there, but God is bringing this together in unity. He's putting all the pieces of the puzzle together, all the different personalities and characters. It's because it's not just, God is not just preparing a message, He's preparing a people. And those two things come together at the same time. So I think that's the important lesson to learn from this. So, you know, we saw there that Noah, just to sort of finish off this chronology, you have the 40 days from the times the tops of the mountains appear, and we know we now have 3 periods of 7 days. And then we have a bit later, so I didn't write it in there, I guess I can write it in. We have the first day of the first month, and this is when the ground is dry. So it's dry, or the waters at least have come off, so the 150 days. But for them to get out of the ark, maybe the water is off the earth, so the waters are off. And then here on the 27th day, so it's the 27th day of the second month, that they now come out of the ark. So here they take the roof off the ark. Here they leave the ark. So,
We have a hiding period, 150 days, the first 150 days, the earth is hidden. The 5 months comes through the day.
yeah. And we also, from the, where did I did something wrong here. Oh, that's what I did wrong. So this is not correct. So this is actually somewhere over here on an unspecified point. And this, from here to here, is 120 days. There's actually 1 month in here. So I knew there was something wrong looking at that. So actually from the time the tops of the mountains appear to the first day of the first month is 120 days. So we have some numbers that we have dealt with in other places all through this story of Noah. 120 days, 220 days. We have the 2 sevens at the beginning, the 3 sevens there near the end, 3 periods of 40 days. We have a 30-day period in there.
Your 220 days starts after the second 7 also.
Oh, okay, good. Yes, thanks again. There we go. Yeah, and this is then a chiasm 4740. No, the chart in the book's fine. Yeah, the chart in, yeah, because it's after the second 7 days that the 220 starts. 120 is correct.
150 and 150.
Yep, those are all correct. The chart's correct in the book. Okay, so let's just close with prayer. And Tyler, do you want to close with prayer?
Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for this class that we've just had. We thank you for this mark of divinity that you've shown us, Lord, in your chronologies and in the way that you've dealt with your people since the beginning of time. We pray that you would continue to unfold these things to us, that we could become closer and closer to you, Lord, and that we could become closer to each other in unity. We pray that you would open to us the truth, Lord, or any problems in the way we're seeing these things, and we ask that you would just lead us through these studies, Lord. We thank you for your blessing, Lord, and we ask that you would give us safety this day as we go about our business, that we would keep you ever in mind and ever in thought, in our words and in our actions. And please bless the school and bless everyone that is here, Lord. We thank you and we love you. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.